The other thing that I find a little bit troubling about the way RWP has gone is this whole issue about criteria around the use of force. And again, what's really interesting is that was something that wasn't actually in the original Brazilian concept note. So it spoke in general terms about force must be a last resort, well, yes. It must be proportionate, yes. It must be discriminate, yes. All of those things are entirely consistent with what was agreed in 2005, entirely consistent with the UN Charter, and are just articles of good practice. There are also, of course, legal requirements of international humanitarian law. Some advocates of R2P have sort of jumped on this and say, well, we need to bring back the debate about criteria and guidelines for the use of force. I've always been a bit suspicious about this for two reasons. First of all, is a sort of political, pragmatic reason, which is that I think the level of political capital that would have to be invested in order to get agreement on what those criteria might be, on what those criteria actually mean, is just huge. I think it would tie up the whole debate about R2P for years to come. Now, the second problem is that even if you did that, I don't think criteria would make any difference whatsoever to decision making. In my teaching, in my classes sometimes, I give my students the criteria and I say, well, okay, this half of the room need to argue the case for armed intervention in country X. This half of the room need to argue the case for against intervention in country X using the criteria. And my students in half an hour in their groups can come up with compelling reasons using the criteria both for and against. So of course member states will do the same. Given criteria, all they'll do is use the criteria either to justify their own position or oppose the other people's position. I mean, there's no evidence that such criteria actually change behaviour, facilitate consensus building. I think there's a lot of evidence in the working practices of the Council. The Council has itself built informal procedures, informal ways of doing business that mean that most of these decisions and discussions are actually held. I mean, I think a lot of this discussion was held prior to the adoption of Resolution 1973. If memory serves me right, the actual meeting was delayed a couple of times in order to allow for further discussion, and I think that some NATO members gave fairly extensive briefings and took questions on these issues. So those are the two bits that I have a bit of an issue with, but I think they're not central to what responsibility of force protecting is all about. Two things that I think are central in relation to the use of force are firstly this whole issue of accountability. I think rightly or wrongly, I think some members of the Security Council felt that NATO wasn't wholly accountable to the Council after it acted on the mandate. There's been some discussion about, well, should there be a new mechanism sitting above the Council to hold implementing states to account. Now, I don't think a new mechanism is needed, and I think a new mechanism could create all sorts of unintended issues and problems. For example, first of all, would that mechanism apply only to R2P cases or to the whole range of Chapter 7 peace and security issues? What would it mean in terms of what sorts of authorities would that mechanism need? It would need to have authorities over and above the Security Council, and that's some pretty awesome legal authorities that it has. I mean, when you have the International Court of Justice saying that Council resolutions are not subject to judicial review, to then create a mechanism that sits above the Council and reflects on what the Council is doing and can determine what the Council is doing, I mean, the legal implications of that are huge. I think a much better and smarter way of actually getting this done is through looking at the Council's resolutions itself. So the Council in the past sort of 60 years has developed all sorts of accountability measures that it uses in its own resolutions where it can hold member states to account. So for example, in peacekeeping mandates, it learnt from the mission in Congo in the 1960s that you don't want an open-ended mandate. So it started putting term limits on peacekeeping mandates, so 6 months, 12 months, which requires you to come back to get another resolution. And of course we know that that's harder to do than just renewing the mandate. So that's one thing that could be done. So member states might decide that in the next situation that's a Libya-like situation, they might say, well, you can have a mandate, but the mandate lasts for 2 months, and then you've got to come back to the council, and the council gets to review what you're doing, and if we don't like it, we can kill the mandate, and we can tweak the mandate, or we can change the mandate. You can also insist that member states report. So I mean, Resolution 1973 did require NATO to report to the Secretary General, and NATO did, to be fair, report to the Secretary General. But the Council could insist that they come and report to the Council. They could say, states acting on this mandate must come and give us an informal briefing on what they're doing to implement this mandate by such and such a date. And the Council can do, and has done that sort of thing at times in the past. It can do its own fact-finding if the Council wants to know what's going on. It can dispatch, it can either ask the Secretariat to go and find out and tell the Council and say, we want to report by next week on what's going on. Or in the past, in the very early years of the Council members themselves would go and do it. The Council would say, okay, we're going to set up a little committee, 3 members, off you go and find out what's going on and report back to the Council. So I think those sorts of mechanisms, delving back into the Council's history and seeing, well, what has the Council done in the past, or ways in which the Council can start to build in accountability measures. And of course there were some, let's say in 1973, I mentioned the reporting requirement back to the Secretary General, but also there were specific limitations on the mandate. So 1973 specifically said there must be no ground troops as part of this, and there were no ground troops as part of this. So that's another way in which the accountability gap can be closed. The more specific the Council is in its mandating. Of course, all of that needs to be balanced against issues about military effectiveness. So that's the other side of the argument. That the Council, in passing these mandates, is asking member states to put their citizens in harm's way in order to achieve the Council's goals. So it must be aware and made aware of the need for military effectiveness. And of course the UN has history, and bad history, of past cases where the Council has tried to micromanage. Bosnia is a classic example where the Council tried to micromanage to an extent. I think the mandate for UNPROFOR changed over 70 times in its 4-year history, which meant that some force commanders went on record as saying, we're not going to pay much attention to the mandate because it's so complicated, it's difficult to know what it is. And it's so out of tune with the resources we actually have that we'll allow our strategy to be developed by and guided by our resources. So it's important that those considerations are borne in mind. And one option that people might consider is again going back to making use of the Military Staff Committee, which still keeps meeting. So it's a military experts level committee. It was originally set up to advise the Security Council on collective enforcement measures. So there is this military expertise sitting there at the UN that could be called upon to provide informal briefings about the military requirements for various sorts of activities, and so those are things that could be used for that. Oh, there were two other just to underscore. One is, of course, I think the whole edifice of RWP underscores the focus on prevention, and I would underscore that again. I think what came out from yesterday, member state after member state after member state was saying prevention, prevention, prevention. Well, I think now we've got to move from rhetoric to reality. We've got to start talking about strategies for prevention, a UN system-wide approach to thinking about prevention, to building the capacities to do prevention, and ensuring that assistance is given to member states, to civil society groups and others to actually get the work done. And I think, for me, one of the key calls from yesterday was, let's get on with the work of prevention. We all recognise that Pillar 3 is difficult, it's controversial. Let's reduce the number of times the world is called upon to do Pillar 3 activities by acting earlier. But again, the challenge, as I said yesterday, the challenge to member states on that is you cannot with one arm say, let's do prevention, and with your other arm block early action in a crisis. So there has to be some sort of grand bargain, where on the one hand resources and attention is genuinely committed to making prevention work, but on the other hand member states are prepared to allow preventive action to happen. And then the third aspect of RWP that I very much appreciate is the call for judicious analysis. And again, as I said yesterday, I think there's a role here for member states and for regional arrangements to input their own advice and information. I think it would be very helpful for regional arrangements to mirror the UN in developing their own early warning capacity so they can feed in analysis to what the UN is doing. and helpful for member states to embrace it by maybe appointing their own focal points so they can do their own early warning and feed in analysis and advice to the decision making. But above all, again, I think it's a call upon the member states to make use of the UN Secretariat, who has a specific role in the Charter to provide impartial advice to the member states and to build the UN's analytical capacity in that regard.